So now we're beginning, and I want to say this is a paper researched jointly with Jon Woodson, who is an American academic, and I'm sorry that he can't be here, and he is as well, but your feedback will be relayed to him with interest. And what we want to do here is to show how this group of African-American writers in the 1920s in New York were absolutely inflamed by an esoteric teaching, basically European Western esoteric. And these are writers who are associated with or known as the Harlem Renaissance. And they're very high up in the hot list of writers. Hi, come in. But critical evaluation of them has not taken into account this very important esoteric influence. So this is really what I want to show you, this kind of connection, as well as to show you how the Lawful Inexactitudes helps us to prove that. Now, this is Zora Neale Hurston. As you can see, she's a very energetic and exuberant-looking woman. She was highly educated in Howard University and Columbia University. She did postgraduate work there. She was an anthropologist and folklorist, and she wrote about 50 short stories and essays and 5 novels. So she's very highly rated as a writer, but as I say, this esoteric content hasn't really been evaluated at all. So now I'm going to sort of try and show you how this trek from European Western esotericism moved over into New York and influenced this group of people. So the first person I want to show you is Alfred Richard Orage, 1873 to 1934. He was a poor boy born in Yorkshire, but he was helped to have an education, and he became a charismatic school teacher. And he was one of those people who has serial passions, and his passions went from Plato to Nietzsche to psychoanalysis. He explored all those avenues and he lectured on them. And then in 1907, he came to London and he edited and was also a proprietor of the New Age magazine, which was an extremely influential literary magazine. And as he was very charismatic, he drew a lot of people to him. So here are, just to give you a sort of feeling of the people, at top row, George Bernard Shaw actually helped to finance the New Age. He also published Chesterton. He was first publisher of Catherine Mansfield. T.S. Eliot said that Orage was, let me find the quote, the finest literary critic of his day, and the finest critical intelligence of our age. So he was very highly regarded. And then we have, underneath we have Ezra Pound. And Ezra Pound also wrote quite a number of editions of the New Age with Orage. And over on the right here is, looking rather haughty, is Ouspensky. And Ouspensky wasn't published by the New Age, but he was the person who introduced Orage to Gurdjieff. So he's important. He's one of the links. And this is Gurdjieff, and I chose this image of him because.
Sorry, you missed out Catherine Mansfield.
Catherine Mansfield, did I miss that out? Yeah. I'm sorry. She's been mentioned. Good. I like cooperative, interactive discussions. Thank you, Leon. Thank you. This is Gurdjieff, and I chose this image of him because after Orage had been to one talk of him in 1922, he just decided to give up his literary life and go off to France to study with Gurdjieff. And you can see from this that he's the kind of person that might persuade you to run away from your life and go and do something else. So Gurdjieff was born possibly 1886, we don't know, died in 1949 in Paris. He was Greek-Armenian, and his teaching really comes from a variety of Western esoteric sources, but with quite a lot of theosophy in it, which he always denied. He denied practically everything, really. But it's true. It is derived quite a lot from theosophy. And he was one of many gurus wandering around Europe after World War I, when the everybody was very destabilized after the war, and people wanted an alternative to the Christian religion, something that would give them a different set of values and a different set of ideas to look at. So he was one of those, although he has actually remained culturally influential, probably longer than most of the others. And what he was teaching really basically was, he said that human beings are asleep and that we function as machines, and that we function as machines and we need to wake up. And this is important for two reasons, because if we don't wake up, we won't acquire a higher level of consciousness, which is what we need to have a soul. And that means that when we die, we just wiped out and perish forever. So that was one reason. The other reason it's important is because, and this is an idea that it comes back from other people, that unless there are a certain number of conscious people on Earth, then the planet itself is endangered in some evolutionary cosmic way, which you will be happy to know we will not go into in any detail now. But so he was teaching awakening. And because it's a very complex teaching, I'm just going to mention two things which are public. He made public. One was his sacred dancing, and the other is his writing, which is eventually published in 1950 posthumously, but was very well disseminated before it was actually published. So this is his institute, the Harmonious Development of Man. Just sort of outside Paris. This is a fairly recent image of it. I can't remember how many hundreds of acres of forest it had. It was a very large place, and he had lots of students there. And his sort of early life, we're not really going to deal with, because he mythologized his life completely. So we're just going to start looking at him from 1922, when he's at his institute. And Paris, of course, was a centre of modernist creativity, lots of sculptors and painters and writers who were around. And also a huge number of people with esoteric interests, because Paris had always been a centre of esotericism, and the same disruption that brought people from Central Europe and from Russia brought people with esoteric interests as well as art interests. And then the Surrealist movement, and a lot of Americans were attracted over to Paris. So it was really a hub of creative activity. And for a while, Gurdjieff's teaching had a very public face. He put on demonstrations of his sacred dancing on Saturdays, and people would come down from Paris, and everybody wanted to go. He was really regarded as a mage or a magician. And Diaghilev, for example, loved the dances and wanted to actually incorporate them in his theatrical shows. So we just show you what a very public face it had. This is it comes from obviously a tiny little snapshot, but this is just an image of the sacred dancers. Here they're practicing in the theatre of the Champs-Élysées in 1923, just before they were going off. Gurdjieff was going to take them to America. They were really his kind of calling card into America, his way of interacting with the public. And so he sent Orage ahead of him to sort of prepare the ground for him, and so there we are. I like this image of them. Where they arrived. Orage had already arrived in December, and because of his literary connections, he was a very good ambassador to have sent, because he already knew a lot of the American writers. So he set about publicising the visit. And it was an enormous success. So Gurdjieff was a kind of, he would have been in Hello had there been a Hello at the time. You know, he was the person that everybody wanted to meet. So that really meant that Orage then could start giving lectures about Gurdjieff's teaching, and start forming Gurdjieff groups to actually study the teaching almost immediately. So it was very, very fast entry into New York world. And this is, at the top you have Margaret Anderson and Jane Heap. They were editors jointly of the Literal Review, which was probably the most influential literary journal of early 20th century. Very, very influential. And down here we have James Joyce. They were first publishers of James Joyce. And this is William Carlos Williams. This is Hart Crane, who also became slightly involved with the Gurdjieff movement. Anderson and he met Gurdjieff when he was in New York, and then next summer they went back to his institute to spend the summer at his institute. And they remained very, very deeply involved with the Gurdjieff teaching for the rest of their lives. So you can see really from the cultural centre of London and Paris and New York, there's a huge kind of literary network that was beginning to connect up and that knew about Gurdjieff. Well, Orage stayed in New York to field this growing interest, and Gurdjieff came back to Paris in June, but in July he had a terrible car accident in which he was nearly killed. And after that, he decided that he was actually going to, whether because he was entirely surrounded by writers, I don't know, but he decided he was going to put his teaching into a written form, and so he stopped all the things he was doing at the Institute, and he began writing. And the book that he was writing was eventually published as Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson, or The Tales. And as each chapter was written, it was sent off to Orage in New York to be edited. And these chapters became really central to the teaching that Orage was doing. So an analysis and looking. So they were very, very bound up in the text. And they did regard it as a kind of sacred text or a scripture. And Gurdjieff said that he buried a secret in the text, and his pupils should look for it. So that's tremendously enticing. So all Gurdjieff's pupils and Orage's pupils were searching for this secret. And he actually said there was a way of indicating secret, which was called a lawful inexactitude. And he actually described this as saying, well, if you saw a sculpture and it had beautiful, perfectly proportioned, but very big hands, if you were alert, you'd think, well, why could a person who could obviously produce a perfectly proportioned sculpture have these, what are these big hands doing? What are they hiding or revealing? So he was saying you have to be alert, really, and look for anomalies or something out of place, something that isn't quite right. And then you've got to say to yourself, why is it there? And having spent 3 years entirely internal to this text, I can tell you it's extremely hooking and very hypnotizing text in the way that it's written. So people tend to fall into it, and they write it, and they go on, they read it, and they go on reading it time after time after time. So it has this effect really on them. Now this is the Harlem study group that Zora Neale Hurston belonged to. It was run by C. Daly King, who was famous as a writer of detective fiction, and Jean Toomer, African-American, who published Cain, which is an account of the Deep South, which was also, he was a celebrity for doing that book. These are some of the other writers who were in this Harlem Gurdjieff group, and they were all prolific writers, and they all wrote coded text using Lawful Inexactitudes and other sort of literary techniques, and possibly they were spurred on. Well, there were an enormous number of things that would have spurred them on, but possibly one of them would have been the sense that there had to be a certain number of conscious people, that conscious people would save the world. And looking at it now, it's very similar to people who want to save the planet through, being green, and it has the same kind of panic feeling about it. So they all wrote differently, but they were all basically rewriting Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson in different ways. That's one way of looking at it. And they had to find ways of expressing the lawful inexactitudes. And Hurston was obsessed with Egyptology. She was an anthropologist, and Egyptology was incredibly interesting and popular and fascinating in the 1920s because the tomb of Tutankhamun had been opened by Howard Carter in 1923. And in fact, then it had to be closed up. It was reopened in 1924, and Alain Locke, who was a professor of Hurston's at Howard, was there at the reopening of it. So he was her mentor at Howard. So she obviously had a close connection with it. But the person who influenced her in writing is Gerald Massey, there on the left. And Gerald Massey, 1828 to 1907, and he was an Egyptologist, a poet and a scholar, and he published sets of volumes of work of his own independent research. And he was convinced that the myths of Horus Osiris in ancient Egypt are the precursor on the same as the myths of Christ. They both died and they both resurrected and found eternal life. And he found enormous numbers of parallels, and he explicated that. But more importantly for us, really, is that he found phonetic links between ancient Egyptian, I don't know how he worked that out, but from the hieroglyphs, the sound between ancient Egyptian and the English language. So he wrote a great deal about that, and as he's the only person who made this link, we can see that when Hurston makes these links, it comes from him, because there isn't anyone else that was actually doing it. So now, getting to this story, Monkey Jump, which he wrote, we're going to have a look at the title, because this is a story about a man who marries a scheming woman for his money, and he thinks that he understands women and that all women are in love with him. This is not true. She's just really interested in his money. When he doesn't really give her enough money, she just goes off with other men and they give her money. And so he wants to divorce her. But because she goes off and buys raiment, silken hosen, and crosses her legs and is very flirtatious and weeps a lot in the court, she in fact gets unfairly granted alimony. So it's a really unfair trial. It's unjust. And he's really, in a way, he was stupid to begin with, but he doesn't come out of it well. So why would you call that story Monkey Jump? That is a lawful inexactitude in itself. And monkey is actually, Massey writes about the Ankh key of life. So Anki, monkey, phonetically connected. So that would remind you of Massey. And he said the Ankh key of life refers to the living one. This is Osiris, the son of the resurrection. So this is about Osiris Horus who overcomes death. So that's the coded reference in there. The other word, junk, which is also an Ankh reference, Massey refers to also rhyming sounds a lot, and junk he also refers to as being related to the Ankh. In the 1920s was slang for opium, so like junkies, slang for opium, and opium is the sleep-inducing drug which Borage and Gurdjieff were trying to wake people up from the sleep. There's a lot about opium in the tales and about Egypt as well. So you can see that by this two-word title, she's giving you a kind of dichotomy between sleeping and waking, which is clever, really. So the next thing is, as some of you have seen copy, it's written in sort of faux biblical verses, and it's funny and entertaining. But that actually, when you look through the numbered verses, there's no verse 15, which, when this was rediscovered really recently, nobody noticed at all. I have to say, Jon Woodson noticed it immediately because he's trained to look for lawful inexactitudes. And so, if you're an alert reader, you're going to say, well, she has a reputation because of all these various things for being rather careless. So people think, oh, that was Zora Neale. She was a bit careless, and she was sometimes sloppy with her grammar and her spelling, and she missed things out. But that's not the case at all. She was an academic. She was very highly trained. She knew what she was doing. So you'd have to say, well, 15. this is a story about an unfair trial, and it's written in a biblical format. So could you connect 15 with anything biblical and see if there's a trial involved in it? So if you're looking at the Gospels, look at the Gospels and see if the 15th chapter of any of the Gospels have anything to do with a trial in it. And there is, because in chapter 15 of Mark's Gospel is the trial of Jesus. So also a very unfair trial. And verse 15 is the verse where Pilate hands over Jesus to the multitude to be crucified. So this little something that's missing has brought you in another layer of references to this story. If you're alert enough to see it. The second thing is that it's very short, but there are a huge number of organs and body parts in it. There's a list of them. And I noticed these and said to John, you should have a look at this. This definitely means something. And he said, oh, I didn't see it, but it's referring to the trial of Osiris by Thoth, because the whole centre of the drama of Osiris and how he becomes immortal is there is a trial of him. And I just actually, I'll read you Massey's account of the trial, because it is quite frightening and scary. And this is Osiris being tried by Thoth, his death. The book of the body was opened and its record read. The vital organs, such as the heart, liver and lungs, were brought into judgment as witnesses to the life lived on earth. Any part too vitiated for the rottenness to be cut off or scraped away was condemned and flung as offal to the powers, who are called eaters of filth and devourers of hearts and drinkers of the blood of the wicked. And if the heart, for example, should be condemned to be devoured because very bad, the individual couldn't be reconstructed for a future life. So, but Osiris, as we know, passed through this trial successfully and became immortal, as indeed did Jesus, and became the Christ. So there are a lot of other trials referred to in this story. Just time constraints, I can't go into all of them. Also, the biblical references there are a lot of just quotations or just misquotations that you can read, and the ones that I've looked up, all of them are pertinent. They aren't just in there because it's biblical, and you say, "Oh, that's a biblical reference. That's cute." They all actually refer to a bit of the Bible which is relevant to this story in one way or other. One is reference to Proverbs 6, which comes from "Go to the ant, thou sluggard," and it's all about sleep and it's awakening. It's awakening, and it's about the person who doesn't awake, suddenly his end will come upon him. So it's completely relevant to what the story is about. And I just have time to tell you about one other trial that we ought to mention, which is in 1925 there was something popularly known as the Scopes Monkey Trial, and that was a trial of a man who was charged with teaching evolution in a Darwinian sense, which was actually against the law in America at the time. So this is really, it's interest to anthropologists because it focuses on the split between religious and scientific understandings of evolution. And although the man who brought this case was legally in the right, he was defeated by his attorney because the attorney put him in the stand and really made a fool of him. You can see the scripts of the trial on the internet. And he just asked him questions about Adam and Eve and how did the children arrive and various specific questions. And by doing that, he showed that you couldn't read the Bible literally if somebody questions you enough about it. So this trial is also saying that you must pay attention to what you read. You must wake up. You must not just believe everything that you're reading. And so I'm sure this was, after all, it was an absolutely famous trial, and this is 2 years before this was published, so she would have been possibly writing it in 26. So it's a very hot number. As an anthropologist, she'd be very interested in it. And incidentally, Gurdjieff wrote a parody version of this in a chapter of the Tales. Now, Orage, meanwhile, we have rather left him out, but he was teaching this conflation of the Osiris-Jesus myth to his students, so they were actually already familiar with that. So the writers were doing something, they were attempting to do something which is really impossible, which happened secret. 5 minutes? Oh, it's the end of time, that's right, what's the time? They tried to do something difficult, which is they wanted to point to a secret, but in a concealed way. And this is always the trouble with elite and secret groups, because it's important to keep it a secret, because it's valuable, it must be protected. But at the same time, they have to recruit, and they need other people to know about it, in order to save their souls and the planet, to put it very crudely. So, it's really difficult to know how to deal with that. But they all worked very, very hard at it. I mentioned briefly, there are a lot of fallen. This woman is obviously a fallen woman. In the story, she's a prostitute. She sells herself for money, and there are lots of references to fallen women throughout, including Eve, who's also unfairly, in my view, regarded as a fallen woman. So there was that. So I think you can see how this very unlikely mix of African-American writers got involved in the Gurdjieff work and very assiduously involved in it. And now this is a very good story to show it, and John and I will be working on a longer paper of this, and we'll probably do a book about it, because it's so short that you can, and so densely referenced, that it's very easy to show that when you're saying that, if you want to look at a novel, you've got to write reams and reams, and will you get anyone to read it? Probably not. But if it's something short, then you can begin perhaps to influence the critical evaluation of this. So I hope you've enjoyed that, and I look forward to lots of questions about it when we have question time. And thank you very much.